We're delighted to bring you the seminar presented by Labroots. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's keynote presentation titled Cannabis Medicine is Flowering, How Clinical Trials Validate Cannabis. It's my pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Debra Kimless. Dr. Kimless is the Chief Medical Officer for Pure Green. She is also the Medical Director for Forward Grow and Chief Science Officer for Merida Capital Partners. For a complete biography on our speaker, please visit the tab at the top of your screen. If any questions should arise during this presentation, we encourage you to submit them into the Q&A box. Our speaker will respond back to you via email. And as a reminder, this presentation is educational and offers free continuing education credits. Click on the Continuing Education Credits tab located at the top right corner of the presentation window and follow the process to obtain your credits. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kimless. I will now turn the presentation over to her.
Hi, everyone. My name is Dr. Deb Kimless, and today I'm going to speak to you about how clinical trials validate cannabis. First, I want to thank Labroots for giving me this opportunity to speak today, and I want to thank the audience as well for being interested enough to listen. So my disclosures, I'm the Chief Medical Officer for Pure Green Pharmaceuticals, a processing and cannabis growing company in Michigan. I'm the Chief Scientific Officer, Merida Capital Partners, and I'm the Medical Director for Forward Grow, a cultivation company in Maryland. So when I usually give talks and webinars, my passion really is about educating people about the health benefits or the medicinal attributes of cannabis. And this is a new kind of discussion when we foray into conducting clinical trials, because there's really not a lot of clinical trials being conducted currently. And we're going to talk about, one, why it's important to even consider doing a clinical trial using cannabis medicine. Two, what are the issues regarding that, surrounding that? What are the challenges? And we're going to talk about some successes. But before we head into all of those things, the interesting thing about cannabis is that cannabis as a medicine is not new. It's not a novel drug. And in fact, the earliest recorded use of cannabis as medicine is in 2737 BC, where in ancient China, the emperor fancied himself a pharmacist, and he used cannabis to treat patients suffering with gout, arthritis, and absent-mindedness, or Alzheimer's, or dementia, which I find incredibly interesting. In 1000 BC, in India, they used a drink called bhang, where they mixed cannabis with warm milk, and they actually used it as an anesthetic. And the ancient Egyptians used cannabis for the treatment of tumors. And in 200 BC, the ancient Greeks used cannabis topically to treat their war horses after a battle, to help reduce inflammation and promote healing. And then they recognized the successes in their war horses and started treating patients who suffered with earache or edema or swelling, inflammation, and other veterinary medicine issues. And from 1851 to 1941, cannabis was listed in the US Pharmacopoeia as an actual medicine. And this is what a label would look like if you went to a pharmacy back in that time, where you could actually purchase a cannabis tincture. It was interesting because my grandfather actually practiced in the late 1920s to 40s, actually to 60s, as a pharmacist. And he would have, this is something that he would have administered to patients. So it's very common. But I can't describe how curious it might be or coincidental it might be that as the prohibition for alcohol stops, the prohibition for cannabis starts. And there's a whole lot of social reasons for this vilification of cannabis flower. And I'd like to send everybody to Martin Lee's incredible book called Smoke Signals that actually sort of describes all of the things as to why cannabis has been vilified over time. But also around the same time, there was a push for getting rid of snake oil and looking at single molecules to examine as a pharmaceutical. And so cannabis as a botanical has over 400 molecules, and therefore seemed confusing as to which was the active ingredient and not. And so therefore, besides a whole lot of other reasons, has been vilified and was taken off the U.S. Pharmacopoeia. And so part of that is about people just didn't understand how this worked. However, there was a time when we actually didn't understand digestion, right? I mean, people didn't parse that out, including recently, where we're now just describing the importance of the microbiome in our GI tract and how not only does it allow us to onboard macro and micronutrients. Without an intact microbiome, we probably would not be as healthy as we are. And yet we're okay with continuing to eat. Clearly, this was a pre-coronavirus picture. Yet, even as early as the vilification of cannabis in the 1940s, really smart scientists were working on figuring out, one, the endocannabinoid system, and two, all of the elements as to how our own endogenous cannabinoids work within that system, as well as how the cannabis plants chemicals work within our own endocannabinoid system. These things originally came out in the mid to late 1980s, and to this day, we're still learning more and more. It's sort of like an onion. As you peel it back, we learn more and more information about the endocannabinoid system and about the cannabinoid molecules and how they interact within our biologic system. However, even though none of these things have been completely characterized, people are still using cannabis for all kinds of medical conditions. So much so that patients have seen incredible successes with lots of things, including refractory epilepsy, people who have wasting with HIV/AIDS, and therefore they created advocacy groups that actually pushed policy and legislation to demand state rights, even while cannabis remains a federally illegal drug. And so currently, there are 33 states and the District of Columbia, plus Puerto Rico and Guam, that have some sort of medical cannabis program. And there are a bunch of different constellation of conditions beyond the refractory epilepsy and wasting syndrome from HIV/AIDS, for which people are using medical cannabis. And the challenge is that policymakers and doctors and maybe patients feel that this cannabis stuff is a giant human experiment. And we need to understand and characterize these molecules and see the safety and understand the efficacy. And that's the drive. But the interesting thing about cannabis is not only its widespread ability to interact with a whole bunch of other biologic systems in our body and affect a change in a positive way, but their safety profile is tremendous. And thus far, there are 0 deaths from cannabis. So meanwhile, we need to answer these people who believe that this is a great blinded experiment. And people always want to say, but we need more proof. So I did a PubMed search just of keywords like medical marijuana, medical cannabis, cannabis, marijuana, marijuana effects, marijuana clinical trials, cannabis clinical trials. And without any effort, I found over 88,000 articles written on this subject. Yet many, many people are still screaming that they want to understand where the clinical trials are, show me the proof. And, until that happens, they're not going to believe that cannabis is a medicine. So what does it take to do a study? So remember when we were in middle school or high school, we had a science class and they said, okay, in order to do a study, you have to come up with a hypothesis, an idea. I believe cannabis is a medicine. And then you have to create an experiment. Okay, we're going to try, a bunch of people using cannabis, and then you're going to follow the results and come up with the conclusions. Sadly, our FDA looks at this in a little bit more granular, and it's not so easy. So first we have to define what is a study. So people who look at case reports, things that I share all over the country and all over the world with patients that I see and help guide using medical cannabis daily, others call it anecdotal because these are one-off cases of patients who report using cannabis for a specific indication and then have a specific result. And that probably is like the lowest study, so to speak, on the totem pole. The next is a cohort study where you can observe a group of people doing something similarly over time. So maybe there's a group of children who have refractory epilepsy and they are all taking CBD. That would be considered a cohort study. And then a case control study where you have two similar groups and they differ only by a medical condition or a treatment. So maybe young, healthy women, one has insomnia, the others do not, and then you give, both groups cannabis, what happens? But the gold standard is something called a double-blind, randomized clinical trial. Although a single-blind randomized clinical trial is a reasonable choice for some as well. But let's talk, what does it take to accomplish a double-blind randomized trial? So first of all, what is it? So the doctor or the healthcare provider who's running the trial and the patient, the recipient of the medicine, both do not know who's getting it. So if you have a particular indication, say diabetic neuropathic pain, and you have a specific formulation of cannabis, say you have a CBD tincture, the doctor doesn't know whether the patient gets the CBD tincture or the placebo. That's what it means by double blind. And randomized means that you have a group of patients that are recruited to be part of that study, and they get randomized. Some get the placebo, some get the active drug, and neither the patient nor the person in charge of the study do not know who's getting it. But then it gets a little bit further. Is this an FDA trial or a non-FDA trial? So let's talk about an FDA trial. So first of all, why would anybody want to do an FDA clinical trial? Well, if a medical cannabis company wants to be able to become FDA approved, just like what GW Pharma did with Epidiolex, and then a doctor can write a prescription instead of a recommendation, and these medicines can be sold in traditional pharmacies rather than cannabis dispensaries, may be worth the while of the company that wants to pursue this endeavor. So let's talk about what it takes to get a drug through the FDA process. So I have here on the slide, slow and slower. And let's look at that a little bit more specifically. So when you're looking at slow, 15 plus years, this is a traditional FDA drug discovery, development, and approval process. This process is long, arduous, and expensive. So the first part is first discovering, coming up with your hypothesis. I think this drug will work for this specific indication. But before the FDA will allow you to even try it in people, we have to do preclinical testing. Preclinical testing means testing in a non-human experiment or study, most likely animals. And that preclinical testing looks at a whole host of things. Not only did it work for the specific indication, but was it safe? What about the toxicology? Was it toxic? What did it do over long term for organs? What did it do regarding future progeny? If, did it cause DNA disruption and therefore issues with further development of the animal, and or if they have other animals, then what happens with them? That takes about 6.5 years. Then the company gets to file what's known as an IND at the FDA. That's an investigational new drug. And you bring all of this preclinical testing and any kind of information that's already known about this drug, journal articles to the FDA. They come back with lots and lots of questions. And meanwhile, what they don't tell you is that you just don't present it via an email, dear FDA. You have to buy specific software so that you have a method that's secure to communicate with the FDA. This is incredibly expensive and arduous to set up. If the FDA says, yes, we grant you an IND, you now are allowed to do a phase 1 trial. Phase 1 trial is in normal humans generally, where you look at pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics, and maybe you'll see some efficacy studies there. Again, looking at the humans now, clinical trials as opposed to preclinical trials to see that this doesn't harm anyone. These steps alone take over 8 years to the tune of somewhere between $50 and $840 million. If you are alive to move forward, if you get some data that shows that this medicine does no harm, you're allowed then to go to a phase 2 trial where you can actually look at patients with a disease-specific indication. And that takes about 2 years. Then phase 3 trials where you get to broaden it and look at any other secondary effects and see how patients respond, safety and efficacy as well. And then those two processes cost somewhere between $50 and $970 million. And then you move forward, you file your IND at the FDA, you get for about 6 months, you go back and forth with questions, you answer questions, they generally ask you to do things, you may have to go back and do more preclinical testing depending upon what the results are. The FDA could review and approve it. It takes about 1.5 years. Once approved, you're allowed to sell the product on an open market and do phase 4 trials, which is basically just doing observations and seeing if there's anything that happens. This entire process, at least 15 years, most likely more. And as you can see on the bottom of the screen, $2.6 billion. Now let's say, okay, well, that's interesting, but my drug is cannabis. And, it's kind of safe. We've been using it now for a long period of time. We just saw that on the slide from 2737 BC. And we know that it's safe and that there's 0 people dying from cannabis. So let's see what the FDA suggested research pathway is for cannabis drug development. So first, you have to decide whether or not you want your cannabis molecules coming from botanical, meaning from the flower itself, or if you want to have it synthetically derived. If you want it botanically derived, there's 2 pathways. You have to either grow your cannabis according to the FDA's botanical guidelines. But before you can do that, you need to have the ability to cultivate. And the DEA has only thus far permitted 1 cultivation for federal cultivating of cannabis. This is out of the University of Mississippi. So you'd have to go through the rigors of applying and getting product from the University of Mississippi, which can take somewhere between 2 to 8 years, if ever, and then submit all the CMC data commensurate with all of those things. You can do a synthetically derived, where the cannabis molecules are made in a beaker as opposed to in an actual plant. Again, this is incredibly challenging because you need to have a company that creates these with a drug master file that they filed with the FDA and is approved by them. And then you would need to, again, use those companies' drug master files and CMC data in order to have your starting material or active pharmaceutical ingredient, also known as an API. Then you have to obtain an investigator who understands how to run clinical trials, someone that knows how to do protocol writing, that understands the pathways between non-clinical and clinical protocols, and all of the investigators, because there are different skill sets with each. The DEA, in order for you to even create your novel medication using either botanically derived or synthetic molecules, you require a DEA Schedule 1 license. So the DEA will refer all of your protocols to the FDA in order to review. So now you're dealing with 2 federal agencies, not just one. All of this takes multiple years. And then, if all of this is successful, you get to start at the FDA clinical process or preclinical clinical process in the slow column. So you've added at least 3 years to traditional FDA drug development. And so you can see how the slower column melds into the slow column at the phase 1 trial. Or they may, even if with the drug master files, they may want you to run preclinical trials at all. This is an incredibly difficult and arduous task that costs a lot of money. So now let's look at the non-FDA trial. So why would a medical cannabis company want to do a non-FDA trial? Well, non-FDA trials are important to differentiate a company, if they so choose to do so, from all of the other medical cannabis companies. Because when patients go into a dispensary, they're confused. And there's a lot of talk out there because, again, nobody is looking at these clinical trials or at least showcasing them for patients. There's a lot of iterations from dosage administration forms and a lot of different cannabis strains out there, and it becomes quite confusing. So a medical cannabis company may want to differentiate themselves, run clinical trials for specific indications, and therefore can help sort of clear the path for patients to make at least a starting choice. What's interesting is that there are state mandates for research. So Pennsylvania and Connecticut and West Virginia are leading the way, actually carving out special licenses for businesses who say that they commit to a research platform for their business, which I think is incredible. And New Jersey is also exploring this option. So all businesses with legal cannabis licenses have an opportunity to do research. And so I did disclose that I am the Chief Medical Officer for Pure Green, and this is what we're going to share with you. This is our non-FDA trial pathway, where I get to think great thoughts and formulate cannabis-based medicine in the form of a sublingual tablet is what we're doing. We then come up with an indication for which we think this tablet would work. We run proof of concept trials. We see how patients respond to it. We refine the formulation if needed. And then we actually conduct phase 2 clinical trials using our formulation for disease-specific indications. We get IRB approval. We list our trial on clinicaltrials.gov. And then that helps promote sales in Michigan, which is where we're located, where we're doing these studies. We also have a smartphone-based app where we have patients log in and utilize this app as a method of communication, and also where we can do pharmacovigilance. We can see compliance. We can get feedback from patients. We can enhance the product and then just continue to tweak our formulation. all of this costs tens of thousands of dollars as opposed to millions or billions of dollars. And all of this takes less than 2 years as opposed to greater than 15. However, it does cost money. And there has to be a commitment from the medical cannabis company that is interested in conducting these types of trials and hiring the right types of people that do this. So I'm a certified principal investigator. We have certified clinical research associates that help write the protocols, do statistical analysis plans, submit documentation to IRB, list trials on clinicaltrials.gov, involve ourselves intimately in recruiting, and it costs a lot of money and it takes a lot of time, energy, and effort. And so the difference between a cannabis business versus a university-related business, such as the ones that are happening in Pennsylvania and West Virginia and Connecticut, is that generally speaking, medical cannabis companies have no in-house resources. So they need someone that's going to help them write the protocol, they have to hire a statistician. Sorry, I'm crazy on my slides. Hire a statistician, hire someone to create the study documents so it can be submitted to the IRB. The IRB is an investigational research board that allows a third party to evaluate the ethics of whether or not this study protects patients and make sure that patients are safe and not harmed. And many IRBs are not used to seeing cannabis-related medicines, and so therefore they have a lot of questions, and there's a whole host of documentation that needs to go along with that submission. And you actually have to hire somebody to run the clinical trial. And then you have to have pharmacovigilance and ensure patient compliance, because that's part of the study. I mean, it's about safety for patients, it's about efficacy for patients, but it's also making sure that patients are compliant and we get solid information. And then at the end, we need someone to collate data, submit it to a third-party statistician, because statistics can be looked at in a whole bunch of different ways. The statistician is blinded to the study, blinded to the patients, and they created a statistical analysis plan initially, and then they will enact that plan when they get the data points to see what those results are. And now this seems like an incredibly difficult heft to move this ball forward and to advance the knowledge of cannabis. But moving the needle on knowledge for anything, but especially medical cannabis, is tremendous. And to be able to participate in that has a tremendous benefits, in that doctors and other healthcare workers will then understand what it is to treat somebody with medical cannabis. And then when you look at a therapeutic order of operations, rather than going directly to pharmaceutical, maybe the initial safer therapeutic option could be a medical cannabis preparation. The other benefit would be legislators and politicians who write rules and regulations could look at this and say, we finally understand in a stepwise approach that there's specific diseases, specific indications, and specific formulations, and therefore maybe cannabis isn't as scary, and they can change the rules that not only will states be allowed to have their programs, but also it was no longer federally illegal, which will allow patient access across the country, as opposed to depending upon their healthcare should not depend upon their zip code. Also, it would allow for normal business type relationships, including banking, which many cannabis businesses don't have access to, which makes, again, running clinical trials very difficult because they don't have access to capital that will allow them to create these programs where they normally maybe would have. And it would also serve as a great relief to patients who baseline know that this cannabis medicine works, but they still have this, feeling of stigma regarding this. Because remember, there are lots of rules that patients can't use medical cannabis if they are participating in certain activities. One is they can't have a gun. Two is they, if they have a federal job, they may lose their federal job. I mean, there's lots of things. There's patients, moms who may need it and they are fearful of losing their children. So by legitimizing cannabis medicine will allow for a whole host of benefits. Oh, another one is children have to leave school property to get their cannabis medicine because school property, if they go to a public school, is federally funded and they're not allowed to take a federally illegal drug while on the school campus. So that means that parents have to leave their place of work because they're the caregiver for these children. Children have to be taken out and they have to go and get dosed and then go back in, and that disrupts, parents' work, children's schooling. The kids are separated out and look different from everyone else. And so all of these things would go away. And so, again, normally I give lectures on my over 400 patients that I speak about. They are case reports. I see tremendous successes regarding patients with lung cancer, prostate, colon, glioblastoma, lymphoma, just to name a few. I do change everybody's diet, so it's not just cannabis medicine, but this is who I am. I'm an anesthesiologist by training, not an oncologist. And so when patients come to me without any other options, I want to make sure that they have the best that they can be. But my passion now and my conviction for the majority of my time is that we are currently through Pure Green Pharmaceuticals running clinical trials that are IRB approved, that are listed on clinicaltrials.gov. And we're seeing tremendous successes. We do understand that these types of trials are not for the faint of heart. I mean, it's not easy to do these things. But the interesting thing about the owner of Pure Green is, I think he subscribes to this. His name is Stephen Goldner, and he was the person that created the liquid form of methadone, and now he is committed to creating a pharmaceutical company based on cannabis medicine, Pure Green Pharmaceuticals, that we are limited by the imaginations of ourselves and the burdens of others. So we're hoping to overcome those burdens with our own imaginations. And with all pharmaceuticals, there really does need to be a balance between safety and efficacy. Anytime we extract an active pharmaceutical ingredient from its original source, there's always up and downstream effects. So if you look at the willow bark where salicylin is, that is used, a chemical used to make aspirin, there's a very big difference between the effects of aspirin and the effects of the chemical from the willow bark. Cannabis thus far, though, has shown a tremendous safety profile, whether it's a single molecule or in combination. There are people that say, and we all agree, of the entourage effect or the synergistic effect of all the cannabis chemicals. So the question is, we have an idea. We have to figure out a way to execute. And we actually have to execute. And then we have to collate the results and share it. And so the question is research. Is it worth it? And in my opinion, I think yes. Now, this was supposed to be my last slide, but in order to sort of acknowledge what's going on, globally with this COVID-19 virus, Pure Green Pharmaceuticals has thought about innovative ways of continuing to push the body of knowledge forward by introducing remote patient recruitment, as well as running our entire clinical trial, non-FDA clinical trials remotely through a smartphone app, and recruiting patients using social media. And I would like to offer anyone in Michigan who has osteoarthritis of the knee pain, if they're interested in participating in a clinical trial in Pure Green, please email me and we'll talk about it. And if anyone has any other medical condition in Michigan that would be interested in future programs, I would like to offer my email as well. We're looking at PTSD, we're looking at diabetic pain, we're looking at insomnia, anxiety. And so please feel free to send me an email. We'll put you on the list so that as our programs roll out, we can contact you. And again, I want to thank you for listening. And I would like to thank Labroots for allowing me this platform to talk a little bit about clinical trials, what they are, the difficulties, the challenges, the successes, and why they're worth the effort. And thank you, and be safe.
Thank you, Dr. Kimless, for that outstanding presentation. For additional informative presentations, view our agenda on our events page. And as a final reminder, our speaker will follow up with any questions you've submitted via email. Thank you again for your participation.